Yeah. You're listening to the Wild Die Podcast. 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 Listen 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 to the Wild Die Podcast.
Welcome to the Wild Eye Podcast, episode 109. My name is Eric Lamour, aka No Sleeves McGee, and here are my co-hosts, Gary McCallum and Karl Kiesler. Morning, gentlemen.
Morning, guys.
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen?
Yeah, ladies.
That's right.
Ladies today because we have a special guest.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've mentioned this on this show. Maybe it was before the show we record our shows, but Karl's been telling us about his GM for Monster Hunters Club and telling us great things about her. So we decided why not invite her, because he said it was her first experience running Savage Worlds. So that's why we're calling this Taking the Plunge. But it's just an excuse to get to meet her. Yeah. Morning, Candace.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are you?
Great. How you doing?
Good.
Yeah, we're going to put you to the test today. We're going to see if everything Karl said about you is true. You're under scrutiny, the microscope. How do you feel about that?
I feel like Karl is a very generous person, so you should keep your expectations low.
Speaking of Karl, I don't know if you know this, but in the Savage Worlds community, Karl's quite the superstar. So you guys work together. Is he a superstar at work too?
No.
So Karl is the most unassuming GM that you will have ever met in your life. I think that the reason that Karl and I actually started talking, I was assigned a seat my first day sitting directly in front of him. Or to the side of him, I guess.
Yeah, to the right of him.
He has a bunch of awesome toys in his cubicle.
All those Funko Pops.
Oh, yeah. And I have a ridiculous toy collection and an obsession with pop culture.
Yeah.
So I immediately saw all of those and was like, who is this person? Maybe we can be friends. So, I want to say it was 6 months of small talk of me being like, oh, Funko Pop. And him being like, cool. And me being like, yeah, toys. And him being like, oh, yeah, toys. And then one day, someone that was, I guess, a mutual friend of ours decided to host a 5e game. And that was actually how we started. Karl was a player in the same game that I was a player in. We had a brand new shiny GM. And then that guy ended up having his first child. So that quickly came to a halt because kids take up that time that you need for tabletop gaming for some people. So that's when Karl offered to host a game. And I think when we all went to that first game after going from this kind of more junior level game to what Karl puts on, which is not a knock to Will. Will is an excellent GM. He's a great guy. He's a wonderful player. But Karl I've cornered on excellence in role playing. So we got a little spoiled, I think. We got all these amazing sets and all these amazing, props and extras. And it really kind of upped the ante for the gameplay a lot. And it was crazy seeing him in his element and then realizing that nobody knows this guy. He's worked here for, I think my second or third day you had gotten your 20-year.
Yeah, I think it was around 20 years that time.
Yeah, you had celebrated your 20-year anniversary and nobody knew that he was into this stuff. So I think the first time anyone the mainstream at work knew that he was a big deal, we all knew that the people that played knew that he was into, fabrication. So we were like, hey, we're doing this haunted house. Do you want to come and make some cool stuff for it? Yeah. And we gave him a room to design, and he designed this awesome morgue with roaches everywhere and these hanging bodies. And people were like, how do you know how to do this? And that's when everybody found out that Karl is a secretly amazing GM that nobody knows about.
Yeah. Nice. I feel like that whole scenario went down something like this. the two of you are standing in your fluorescent tube lit office, having a casual conversation about Will and his GMing skills when Karl hands you his beer and says, "Hold this."
Yes, because I often drink beer at work.
He was so good about it, though. I think having Karl at your table is like the best thing ever, because you know when you're like when you're public speaking and you're trying to talk to people and for just a second you're like, I think I forgot my notes. Oh, yep, I forgot them. And you're just standing there like, and you're nodding at people and people are like waiting for you to say the next thing. Whenever that happens in a game and Karl's at your table, he'll be like, goblins. Oh yes, so the goblins were they were storming your area. Like he can just come in and pick up for you. So
attention.
I like to see the game keep going, and I can kind of sense sometimes when the GM's having stumbling or whatever, and you just want to keep the action going and stuff like that. Just poke the GM a little bit,
Gary just punches them.
I was thinking I drive a ready mix truck like a cement mixer, and there's no shortage of words with the guys that I work with, because usually we just fill in the blanks with any 4-letter word that comes out of our mouth. So usually not as, somebody's nodding at you and they're usually, splurring a lot of things out.
Yeah.
All right. Let's, I want to ask you just a short bio. So when did you start playing RPGs, and what was your previous experience as a GM? Because as what I understand is that it wasn't your first time as a GM, but just first time with Savage Worlds. So what's your background there?
So I'm actually still pretty shiny and new. I have run 2 games now, 1 campaign and 3 games actually. I ran Dread as my very first game with a small group of like 6 or 7 people. And then my second game was Honey Heist. That was supposed to be a one-shot that ended up being 3 sessions long somehow because of scheduling. And then this is my first full-on campaign where I've met with the same group week after week. We have the same characters. I have to keep up with what they're doing, all of that. Before that, my experience with role-playing was exactly that. I had a 5e session in person. I had a 5e session that I was actually playing online as well with a friend that was remote, that was living in New York at the time. That ended because of scheduling, as many of these games often do. And before that, I think that my first inkling that I wanted to get into role-playing games was actually Vampire the Masquerade. I was really obsessed with vampires when I was a teenager, and actually found this shirt. I'm wearing my Vampire the Masquerade shirt.
I noticed.
I found this shirt at Hot Topic. I think it was the first Hot Topic in my state. And my mom had taken me there, and she's like, "You can get anything you want in this store." And I was like, "This shirt is where it's at." And then after that, I recognized that there were books and paraphernalia and a show and all this stuff. So I kind of fell into that first, but I didn't have anyone to play with. And my mom was like, "This seems a little weird that you're doing this thing. This has the giant book and you have to like learn rules. Is this like Ouija boards?" I'm like, "No, but okay." She's like, "When you're older, you can do this stuff. You don't want to get into this stuff too early." And I'm like, "Okay, Mom, it's a board game."
Especially Vampire. It's like, kind of dark, and there's vampires in there, and the Timothy Bradstreet art, and
my mom paged through that book and saw a bunch of like half naked vampires and was like, "You are 15 years old. No, not for you." So I had to wait, and I still haven't played Vampire the Masquerade ever. Ooh. I just don't have anyone who wants to play. So.
Yeah, it's a very angsty game. We used to play it in the 90s, but we just goofed around with it. We just did stupid stuff. All right. So, I mean, I've heard of Dread, never played it. Honey Heist. Karl was telling us about it. That's like a micro RPG, right? Like a 1-page, 2-page thing.
Yeah, it's a 1-page RPG. The front side of the PDF of your sheet has the instructions for your players, and then the back side has the GM instructions. I think you use 2d6 as your die, and it's very straightforward, and it's silly. Like, it's funny. You can get as crazy as you want. You have you play as a bear. There are, I think, up to 6 bears that you can be, and each bear has an individual bear type and a hat that they can wear. And then the whole scheme is that you play bears that are trying to break into a honey convention, hence the honey heist, and steal this most prized honey from the person
nice.
that's throwing the convention. It's really hilarious. It's super funny, especially because your bears are real bears, so they can't speak. But people think that you're friendly. So my group was a roving band of show bears, including the Boston Bruins bear. And it was delightful. They were performance artists.
Smokey in there.
Mm-hmm.
I love the hats.
Yeah. You can have like a fancy derby hat or a fez. Really high quality.
That's great.
Yeah, that one I think that's by Grant Howitt. He does a lot of one-shot RPGs and single page.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously, Savage Worlds is quite different. It's still not 5e and, you know, crunch material, and it's not as beefy as other games, but it's still a lot more beefy than one-page RPG. So why Savage Worlds? Was it a particular setting that you wanted to run, and that's why you went for that game instead of something more simple? Or because I would imagine you've played it before, well, ETU with Karl, so you knew about it a little bit.
Yeah, so ETU was my first experience with Savage Worlds, and so I'm a huge Buffy fan, and before that, I was a huge Scooby-Doo fan, so that was 110% up my alley. Karl kind of gave us an overview of games that we could potentially play when we switched from 5e, and we kind of unanimously chose ETU, especially because we had some very new players that we weren't sure would be able to kind of get their imagination out there into like something that's, you know, Weird West, like Deadlands, or something that's a little crazier. Mm-hmm. So we were like, let's go with something that's mainstream with a twist. And it was a blast. It was pretty much the best time. And I think what I love about Savage Worlds, and this was really solidified for me, Dread is a completely different mechanic. So I couldn't really compare the two. That one is very story driven because people are just pulling from the Jenga tower. You don't really have to worry about any real interruptions to your game or anyone kind of having a learning curve. But playing Honey Heist, so Honey Heist was excellent as a one-shot. When I started kind of taking it into 3 different iterations of that, like 3 different sessions of that story, it was extremely limiting because there's not a lot of there aren't a lot of game mechanics to keep the story moving. Like, it's expected to be, you know, hard and fast, not a 3-session deal. So what I love about Savage Worlds is that it gives me the structure that I need to kind of be able to, you know, push up against and test. So, you know, Honey Heist doesn't really have limitations because you're rolling D6 and your stakes are relatively low. But for Savage Worlds, like, you've got this whole other kind of layer on top of that of, you know, the personalization of your character. And when you roll, like, you're rolling as this other person rather than just like a sheet. When I play 5e, that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like I'm playing, you know, from a sheet. I have to reference, you know, I'm rolling it mostly a 20-sided die, and there's no second chances, there's no do-overs, there's no negotiation. It's all just face value. But what I like about Savage Worlds is that it's a lot more engaging, I think, not just for the GM, but also for the players, because you can kind of have a more personalized experience instead of everyone kind of starting on the same level, which I think is awesome because, you know, if you have somebody who only wants to like raid and loot and pillage in 5e, that takes up a lot of time. But I feel like in Savage Worlds, it encourages more group interplay instead of, you know, kind of like a one man for himself type of thing, which in my experience anyway, 5e can very much be an every man for himself scenario. And I really love Monster Hunters Club because there's this crazy archetype system where instead of building your character just from scratch, there are I think 24 different archetypes that you can start with and then build onto that if you choose. And it's really helped my players kind of quickly become who they are, like who their character is, without a lot of initial like gameplay trying to figure it out. Like, everyone kind of is enmeshed with one another right at jump because everyone knows kind of what function they have in the group. Whereas like with ETU, we had to kind of take some sessions to figure that out together, which isn't bad at all. But when you're talking about playing as like little kids, it makes for kind of more hilarious gameplay because everyone's trying to play to their stereotype. which is funny.
That's really cool and super interesting because recently Savage Worlds has introduced Pathfinder, and one of the hot topics is exactly what you've just mentioned. That's sort of my premise, is that we have so many people coming from D&D that are used to a class structure. Here's your character. This is the idea behind him. This is what he's going to be. And so we've been talking about how they're going to sort of implement that class structure inside such a free-form world like Savage Worlds. And you being a newish GM or game master, you just said the same thing. You're like, hey, they really like the archetypes, which I found rather interesting. That's very cool. It's cool insight.
When we made characters for this game, I think it went over really well. I think everybody like knew exactly. They had like 2 or 3 archetypes. They were like, these are the guys I want to play. You know, the chunk or the rich kid or the shrimp or whatever they are. We all had like these ideas like right off the bat because of like an archetype system. And we have a couple new players, like Susie's kind of a new player. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I think she really picked it up really well with that archetypes in the Monster Hunters Club.
Agree. And I think it's interesting because I feel like the archetypes to me, Monster Hunters Club is a great game for beginner players. The GM should have some Savage Worlds experience. I wouldn't recommend running that right out of the gate if you've never played Savage Worlds, because the archetypes can get confusing. And again, like I also have the perk of having of being, a game mastering Padawan to Karl. So like I have this, ace in my pocket all the time. So I recognize that that's also part of I think part of my success is having the confidence because there's somebody who's so good at my table that's giving me good feedback, as well as somebody who knows this game like the back of their hand and can easily jump in. If I'm like fear check, he's like D20. I'm like, great, there we go. So it definitely makes gameplay a lot smoother. And I think that there's some intricacies to this game that I think ETU didn't necessarily have, especially surrounding character creation. So I think having a more experienced guide would be good. But I think for beginner players, Monster Hunters Club is excellent because, when they're stumped, like Susie, for example, Susie's an excellent player. She really loves each game. Yeah. She brings, her whole self to the game.
She's awesome.
She's really started to loosen up at the table as well, like as she's gotten more comfortable. And what I noticed about her gameplay is that as she's kind of started her character, Reggie, she would kind of only chime in when necessary. But now that she knows that she can always kind of come back to, he's a rich kid, he's going to pay for this. He can make a joke about how expensive his bike is. He can talk about, the vacation in Bali that his family just took or whatever. Like he can kind of make conversation around this one theme. It really helped. I think it really helped open her up because there are some times when I think, there's moments where, like they fought a vampire last weekend. I think everyone was like, what do we do? Everyone was kind of frozen in the moment. And I could kind of see her as a new player being like, I don't know, but she can feel comfortable kind of taking a step back because of who her character is, because he's kind of just like this character that is in over his head with riches. He has an embarrassment of riches. So like, he's not easily fazed by things because he has so much money. He just feels secure. So I feel like it's easier for people to kind of like lean into who their characters are. When they have these archetypes, and it's easier to also avoid kind of metagaming as well. Something I noticed in ETU is that you have people that set up a character that is like Will, for example. When Will was playing ETU, like he set up a character that was a prodigy and was a gamer and was really had money, so he had all of these like different components to his character. But as we started playing the game, they started to become kind of hindrances for him in certain scenarios. Yeah. And I think it gets really challenging when you have this character that you're kind of attached to, but you don't want to play them the way that they're maybe intended to play. Like if they're a little on edge or they're a little crazy and you're in a situation where someone is expecting you to be calm, you should play that character a little crazy because that's who they are. And that's the point. But it's challenging when you're in a scenario and you're like a college student, you don't want your teacher to give you bad grades, and you start thinking about things from an outside of game perspective instead of pursuing, whatever may come of acting out in the game, So I think the archetypes in Monster Hunters Club kind of cut that because you have a specific character that you are always coming back to no matter how you want to play it. Yeah. Like if you're a daredevil, someone asks you to take the jump, you're going to take the jump. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no room for you to kind of question your next move. which I really love. Like, I love how simple it is for people to kind of just jump in and play.
Gives you some direction.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting out of this is that you weren't so much concerned about learning the mechanics because you knew you could lean on Karl to help you out with those. So what did you decide to put your, like, what kind of campaign was it? Was it from an adventure in the book that you started with, or you came up with, because I hear you're a writer. So did you come up with your own story, and what kind of preparation goes into that?
So I was at first, when I first signed on to run this, my first thought was, oh God, how are you going to write this whole campaign? My brother has written an entire 5e campaign somehow in his spare time that he had in college, which I do not possess that amount of spare time, college spare time. I have advertising agency spare time, which is far less. So I remember at first just being really, really daunted. And it's funny that you say that, you have Karl there, so you don't have to like worry about the rules as much. I don't like calling myself a perfectionist because I'm definitely a right-brained kind of person who has like piles of stuff all over their house, but I know where everything is. I'm one of those, as many creative people are. So I wanted to over-prepare because I knew that there were inevitably things that I was going to forget and that were going to fall, by the wayside as I got into the improv element of it. And that was honestly, I think, the thing that was the most terrifying to me was not knowing the rules enough, and not having like a firm enough grip. Like it's very different not knowing the rules like the back of your hand versus not knowing the rules at all. So the first thing that I did to prep was I bought the adventure guide. I actually have the old rules. But I purchased the brand new book, and then I sat down and I leafed through that, and I wrote, notes and things like that. And I have like a little sticky note system, so it's all sticky noted up. And then I read all of the Monster Hunters Club PDF because, as you guys know, it's being shipped like right now.
Yeah.
I actually joined the Kickstarter, supported the Kickstarter back in 2017 when it first started, and was super excited to see all of the updates and to see Karl on the project as well. So once I got through reading the PDF all the way through, my first step was actually to nail down my players, to make sure that my table was set. And then we had a session 0 to make characters. And I honestly think that that's the best way to go about this. I think with ETU, we made characters, and then I think we gamed that same session. Like at the end of the session, we had like an initial, I think, round or something like that.
Something like that.
It really helps, especially I think for new GMs to have a session 0 where you're actually like doing active planning with your team, because when I sat down with them and everybody started talking to me about what they were interested in, it gave me a lot more perspective on how I could shape the story to best kind of suit all of them. So I have a psychokinetic person at my table. I have somebody who's doing the wild child, which means she's, fire starter kind of girl. She can, use crazy powers and telekinesis and all that. So there's a storyline in Monster Hunters Club, like a Savage Tale, about a girl who also has psychokinetic powers. And I'm like, well, there's no point in doing that if I already have someone at my table. So it was easy to kind of narrow down and pare down which stories I was going to tell. And then I made an overview. So I took all of the solid plot points, like the pieces of the actual Monster Hunters Club storyline, and I laid those out in a timeline in order. And then I went through and peppered in all of the Savage Tales, like where they're supposed to be. So like one Savage Tale is like 2 weeks after the last day of school. One is 2 weeks after the first day of school or whatever. So I put that into a timeline. And then like each week when it's time for me to plan, I just look at what happened the last week. I think about what logically could probably happen the next week, where maybe my players have spoken about going, or places that they, mentioned, taking an interest in or wanting to research. And then I try to just loosely plan for those moments to happen in the game. And
that sounds a lot like what Karl was telling us last episode.
Yeah,
just,
a little.
You guys are a pair, I tell you.
Well, she when she first started, she was like, I think we were texting each other, and she's like, how do I keep track of this and that? And I said, well, players will let you know about hindrances and things like that. And she was asking me a little bit about notes and how I do it. And I think I did send you some of my notes, like what we just did on the last episode. Yep. And I don't know if that helped you or not, but that's just the way how I do it, Like
it was an incredible help, like an incredible help. There was no way for me to figure out how to do this kind of on my own. Like at first I was writing everything by hand, because when I ideate and I do brainstorming and stuff, that's always what I do. I always have a pen and a pad and I'm like ready to like writing things down. So I started that way, and then my hand like just completely fell asleep like 10 minutes in. I was just like, this is not a good way to do this. So then I had to type everything up. Yeah. And seeing your notes gave me at least like a flow. Yeah. Which was really important, because there's so much information, like so much happens. Like we played a short game last night, and I'm still going to have like a page of notes on just what we did. You know what I mean? Just who we met, the things that you saw. So I think that trusting yourself is also something that I'm learning as a GM. Trusting your level of interest in the game, how serious the game is for you. I have a fairly good memory. Like I remember all kinds of crazy things that people forget. But sometimes like there's only so much room in your hard drive. Sometimes that stuff gets, wiped and written over. But I find that every time that I sit down to play with my players, I always remember exactly what happened. Like no problem. Even if I don't have notes, when I sit down to write my notes, I can write them like 6 days later, 5 days later. And I'm still like right there in the game. Like, this is what happened. And this, so that's been really awesome. Just trying to get like trying to get my stage fright over and done with, and trust that my players are going to be, forgiving or not even notice when I mess up.
Yeah. I feel like the universe did me wrong. Could you imagine if you were like super into D&D and you didn't realize that your next door neighbor was like Gary Gygax?
Oh my God. Is that what happened to you?
No, but just it happened to you because Karl's Gary. You're like, hey, I want to try this RPG thing out. Then you look over and here's Karl stand there, right? Yeah, how do I keep? And here's the hindrance part of the whole situation, though, because if Karl would have handed me his notes, I would have probably jumped out the window. Like, you want me to do this? What? My chicken scratch. I've seen it. It's like a piece of art, and it should be in a museum somewhere.
Yeah, they're really great. And he actually like outdid himself. He didn't just give me notes from our last in-person game, because we were actually playing Pathfinder. Like the beginnings of Rise of the Rune Lords, in our in-person game that had shifted from work, because Karl was like lugging all his shit to work, and we were like, let's not do that anymore. He would bring like 6 bags. Yeah,
and it was becoming a problem because people too had to work late, and we were playing on weekdays, obviously, and it was like becoming a problem where, people would just not show up or be late, and we'd have like an hour to play or something. I was just like, oh, come on.
Yep. Mostly me.
Well, you're busy. Well, you're super busy, And everyone wants you to work on their stuff. So
that's true.
Yeah. Let's talk about the work thing, because before the show you were telling us that, well, it's basically you and Karl that started that whole thing. How did that came about?
So like I said, I was sitting right next to Karl on my first day of work, and I complimented him on his toys. And then they actually moved my seat maybe like 3 or 4 months after that, and another girl was sitting there who also was interested in role-playing games. And she actually had, her name's Cassandra, she actually had that initial conversation with Karl about getting some role-playing games done. And Karl was like, oh, I think Will wants to play. Let's see what we can do about that. So that was our very first kind of outing. And then once Cassandra left the company and I was still playing, I was like, well, why don't we keep playing just because Will doesn't have the time to run a game. Right. If Karl's offering to run a game, like we should all absolutely do that. So we used to meet in different conference rooms. Our building has an alarm that goes off at 11. So we used to have to be out by like 10:30 at the latest. And like the cleaning people would come in and like vacuum and like watch us play. Like, so it was really entertaining. And then I want to say toward the end of our ETU campaign, we moved it over to Karl's house on Saturday nights, and that's what we've been doing ever since. So we play every other Saturday.
Yeah, and then go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, when you first started talking to Karl about the RPG experience, was there ever a point at which you looked over and saw like an open book that said layout by Karl Kiesler in like a cool RPG thing? Like Monster Hunters Club, for example.
Yeah.
And you're like, hey, what?
So I think the first time, all right, my background, I'm a copywriter right now by trade. But before that, I was actually in graduate school to become a librarian. So I am a very book obsessed individual. So when I get my hands on a book, I always like page through it and I like look at the notes and all that stuff. So when we were making our characters in our first ETU session, I saw like, I'm like, who does these things? Like, who does these layouts? Like, who are these people? And then that's when Karl was like, well, sometimes I help a little bit, no big deal. It's a side project, just a hobby. I'm like, oh, cool. So then we keep talking. And like a couple weeks later, he's like, I think we were talking about League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He's like, oh yeah, I wrote a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen game. I have a couple I've made actually. It's really fun. People like them. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. So like you make these too? Yeah, it's not a big deal. So fast forward a year, he's like, hey, I'm going to Gen Con. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. You're going to Gen Con? What's that all about? He's like, well, they fly me around the country to run games for people. It's not
it is.
So I'm like,
yeah.
This sounds like a big deal. So then I went online and I was like, Karl Kiesler. And it was like, big deal. And I was like, this is what I thought. I thought so. This is a big deal. So then, of course, I had to call all of my friends that have been role-playing for years and be like, hi, do you know about Savage Worlds? And like 45% of them were like, yes. And of those 45%, I was like, guys, my GM is this guy. And they were very impressed. So now I just tell everybody about Karl, even if they don't know about Savage Worlds, and they're still very impressed. So
it's awesome. I think we got his moniker down now. Big deal.
No,
yeah, that's gonna be part of the show notes now.
Yeah.
We're gonna introduce you as Big Deal.
Yeah, Karl the Big Deal Kiesler.
I'm very
good, doesn't it?
I'm very unassuming, especially at work. I just kept my head to the grindstone and work. And when Will was like, yeah, he was like all into D&D. So I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do it. I wasn't gonna say, no, this is a superior system. I wasn't gonna like stomp on his feet and punch him in the face. I'm all for it, man. If anybody wants to play that, cool, man. I had a good time. It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.
Just think about where Will would be now if you had stomped on his feet and punched him in the face. He would be a better person, Karl. Just remember that.
I don't know. Will's a big guy, so I wouldn't do that.
Yeah. Will would shake your tree.
Yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he's wonderful. I think that it's interesting too because I was talking to him and he's trying to get he has two young sons and he's trying to get the older of the two into role-playing games. So Karl, I think you should probably just like shoot him an email and be like, start them out right. Here's Savage Worlds.
Exactly.
Don't give them this 5e nonsense. They're never going to have time to learn all these rules.
Now, if Will shows up and shakes Karl's tree because Karl recommended Savage Worlds to him, can you record it for us?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Will is super busy though. I don't think like between two kids and like he's like the head of account services or something. Like he's also now a big deal. So look at that.
Yes. Yes.
I just can't believe that you worked with this gigantic team of people in this huge building for 20 years. And like no one has any idea that like you're a great public speaker, that you're awesome with leadership, that you're great, at team building. Like they have this like secret, people pay him to do this job other places and he's at work just like ads.
A lot of them think it's just, you play your board games on the weekends. Yeah, that's what I do. I play board games.
That's exactly it. Scrabble all the time.
I think there's still a little bit of a stigma attached to it, and the nerd, and you don't want to be called a nerd, but I think it's getting it's geek is chic, like they say, right? It's getting really popular, and I think more people are coming out and not afraid to tell other people that that's what they do. I've done it before, and of course I've been made fun of, but Gary makes fun of me every day, so I'm used to that. I can handle it, but yeah, I can understand why Karl wouldn't want to just say, "Hey, I'm playing, role-playing games this weekend." It's just board games or just playing my game. That's usually what I call it. Still some people at work know that I play, but they don't make a big deal out of it, or they don't really understand what it is. And then you got TV shows that kind of poke fun at it, and
Right.
So
it's also our area we live in. We live in South Florida, so it's not really that popular down here because most role-playing games were started in the Midwest, with Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, where half the year it's cold and you got to stay inside and you got to figure out something to do. But down here it's always sunny and you're always outside, so
Right.
It's a different culture. Plus we have Latin American culture down here that really don't know about it too much. I mean, I'm sure there's some out there, but it's not prevalent. You know what I mean?
you just got to start a group with snowbirds. That's all.
Retirement home.
There you go.
Start some modern monster hunters. Those guys would love it, man.
I'm going to wait for you guys to retire and start coming down here.
Me and Eric are going to Thailand. We've already discussed this.
Yep.
That's for another show.
I mean, Gary, you live in Canada, and Eric's a Canadian transplant, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
Eric's going to come and live in my igloo with me. I have spare room in the back of the igloo.
All right. Here's a question. Do you feel like Savage Worlds plays to your strengths as a GM?
Honestly, yeah, I do. So it's funny that you were saying before that people tend to think of you as kind of a nerd when you play this game. I'm someone who's very open about the embarrassing stuff that I'm into, that I'm an adult who has a toy collection, and I still play video games much of the week whenever I can, and things like that, whenever I have some time. So I'm not someone who's ever really shied away from that, but I feel like part of that is because of I don't know. I think my family has always kind of encouraged me to be to explore things that I'm interested in, and like kind of dip my fingers into whatever kind of crosses my path, no matter how ridiculous it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for Savage Worlds, like it kind of I used to be in theater a lot as a kid. I've always been a singer. I've sung in choirs, and right now I host like a weekly ukulele impromptu like live show on Facebook Live. That's
awesome.
ridiculous.
You should guys should tune in. It's really cool. It's good.
It's me and a ukulele.
Let me stop 1 second. So when we were playing the Pathfinder game, when I was converting to Savage Worlds back then, but last year, before the real Savage Pathfinder was announced, we were dabbling in it. She played a bard, Whimsy Thistledown.
Yes.
She was awesome, dude. She wrote a song for a recap.
That's her. Okay.
Yeah, that was her. I told you guys.
Yeah.
She wrote a whole song, played it. It was amazing. I'm like, what? Who does that?
Yeah. I had a guy in my group do that too, except minus the ukulele and the singing part. But he was playing a bard, and he like wrote a full on poem, and it literally like rhymed start to finish.
Yeah.
And he stood up and he read this whole thing, which was a recap of an adventure that we had. But he did it when we were in a tavern. He's like, yeah, I'm going to go stand up and try and make some money. Right. And then that's when he read the recap poem about, it's like that stupid bard from The Witcher. You know how he right. It was awesome. Yeah.
So the song that I wrote, it was a parody of the Witcher song. It's called The Heroes of Sandpoint.
There you go. That's right. It was amazing.
So yeah, I think Savage Worlds, like, it gives you the room to be creative. And again, like 5e, you can still be creative. I know plenty of people who absolutely swear by 5e. I've tried playing again since, and like it's fun, but it's not to me as immersive. There's just too many mechanics to think about like while you're playing, instead of just jumping in and playing your character. And I think what I love about Savage Worlds is that it kind of gives you like this really kind of like free reign to communicate however you want with your players. I get to do, silly voices and serious accents, and like kind of stretch my legs as a vocalist. While I GM, while I play, it's the same thing. Like being able to kind of come up with like little rhyme schemes and like little odes and cinquains, and like kind of use like my poetry skills from back in the day when I'm playing Whimsy is really, really exciting. Like it kind of just lets me bring my whole self to the table, and I think that that's something that's excellent, because like being able to play a game like video games are a good example. Like when you're playing Call of Duty or Halo or something like that, there's a learning curve. Like you have to figure out how to position your fingers on your joysticks. You have to figure out how to precisely time, your headshot. Like there's so much like science kind of that goes into learning how to do that. So if you see me play video games, it's usually like a puzzle game or a platformer of some kind. It's not usually something where I have to like devote half a Saturday just to figure out how to like turn it on. I just don't find any enjoyment out of that. I'd rather figure something out. So that's basically all being a GM is just figuring things out. Someone tells you, hey, I want to do A, B, and C. And you're like, okay, you can do that. Roll me, a die for notice to see if you actually see this thing that you're saying you see. And then if they do then in fact see it, then it's like on me to give them the information that they're missing. But what's nice is that I get to decide and control like when they find things, even if, maybe they find something, but it's not the right time in the game to find that. How do I react to that? Or there's an altercation, they come across bullies, or there's a fight within the group. How do I balance this so that, we still kind of stay on track? How do we problem solve? And I love that, you kind of have to, it almost feels like a never ending puzzle game. Being a GM, it feels like every session there's something like there's like a new mystery to solve. And I love that you're playing right alongside your players in your own way. It doesn't feel like I'm just talking at people. It feels like we're figuring it out together, which I really enjoy. I think that it kind of keeps everybody's attention span a lot better than I think it does when, you're waiting for your GM to kind of like ramble on and give you the full story so that you can make a decision. Like this is much more of a conversation. And that I absolutely adore.
Nice. So what would you tell people, the listeners that are still on the fence about, running a game, Savage Worlds, like, one shot or even a campaign? This is your pep talk to them to, or maybe the Leslie Nielsen airplane scene where they take turns slapping the the freaking out passenger. What would you tell them?
I'd say just take the plunge, man. Any issues that you might think you're going to have are going to be smoothed out by like your third session. Developing a rapport with your players is going to be much more important than getting the rules exactly right, which is why I think this is such a great system for both beginners and players that are more senior and seasoned. I think that if you ever find that you're hitting a wall, there's a bunch of really great resources. The Wild Die podcast obviously is one of them. I also belong to the Savage Worlds Reddit, like subreddit thread, and it's not difficult to find people who want to help you in this community. I actually belong to a group on Facebook too for people that are trying to figure out like what to do with random objects in their house, and they're like, "What do you do with this?" And then people can send in suggestions. You can make that, an undersea biome. You can make that into a horse and carriage or whatever. When people have like trash, like random trash in their house. And definitely, once you start this process, just know that like there's always room for error. There's room to, make up for any time that you may have lost, or if you feel like, one session wasn't great, that doesn't mean the next session's not going to be great. So just remember to kind of take it as it comes, and try to go in as prepared as you feel you need to be. Because if you're not, it's going to be a little bit of a disaster. You'll be in your head for most of it. But I think just kind of go in expecting to form a really nice bond with the people at your table, and just try to do your best, because I think that this is a rule system that kind of allows for figuring it out. It doesn't feel like it's so black and white all the time. You can kind of relax on some of the rules and make your own, house rules that complement the actual rule book, without it feeling like you're playing only 50% of the game or 20% of the game. Like you still feel like you're playing a fully fleshed out role-playing game. So I would just say like, take it as it comes, and just take the plunge. Just set up a time, decide which game you're playing, and then meet with your people. And if that's session 0 and you're just hashing out characters, fine. If it's the first session and you just give them a backstory on where they are, and then you kind of let them run free, you'll immediately start to kind of just react to what's happening. And as you start doing that, it'll be easier and easier and easier each time you do it.
I would add to that and say, bring yourself a closet, Karl. You know, have that guy that nobody knows is nobody, but knows everything.
Yeah.
Have one of those. Find one. Right?
Definitely helpful.
Get yourself a big deal.
Definitely helpful.
That almost sounded like you're going to, get an order of McDonald's before you roll in. You got to stop and get yourself a Big McDeal on the way into your game.
A big deal.
Yep.
Nice. Well, that's very good. You guys got any more questions for Candace before we
I have a gazillion questions, but I got a game in 7 minutes, mister.
I figured.
You game early morning?
Oh, yeah. I try and see.
Sunday?
On Sunday, yeah. Every second week, Sunday morning, I try and do my stuff because I also have a family around my wife's sleeping schedule.
Got it.
Yeah, he's on the West Coast, so he got up like before 6 o'clock this morning to record this. Then he plays till mid morning, and his wife's still sleeping, so then he's good.
We get up, go have breakfast, hang out for a little bit, and then I got an afternoon game. But yeah, we used to, the original recordings when we did the Wild Eye podcast was 4 o'clock my time. I would get up at 3:45 a.m. to do the Wild Eye.
Wow.
Then we changed it. Now I get up at 5:45-ish, make coffee, come downstairs. And yeah, this is me, super vibrant and cracked out at 7 in the morning.
I was going to say, you seem like a really like wonderful morning flower, just like blossoming with the day. So
You hear that, Eric?
Morning Flower. That's your
What's
new
up, Morning
nickname.
Flower?
So we got Morning Flower and Big Deal.
All right. Remember, there's going to be that convention, Eric, where me and you are going to be together in person.
I know.
Are you going to shake his tree?
Oh,
Good with one hand.
Eric comes up to my shoulder. I could shake his tree and every leaf off of it.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was awesome. You're a great guest.
Thank you for having me.
It's funny too, because I told you before the show started that you have an amazing voice. Like there was something about it that I clued into. Like it's very, and then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I'm a vocalist and I play the ukulele and I do all this stuff. Like, okay. I knew it.
Sense.
I knew something was up.
Yeah,
Thank you. That is such a
great.
lovely compliment. I really appreciate that.
You sound better than these two guys I got to hang out with. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, totally.
Much better company.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening. I hope that was helpful to you, and that if you were still on the fence, now you're gonna follow Candace and her advice. She's like a motivational speaker, and that's what it feels like to me. I would, if I was on the fence, I'd say, yeah, let's do it. And then if it fails, then you can always blame Candace.
Agreed.
Let's wrap this up. This is Eric saying, get yourself a big deal.
This is Karl saying, do you want to Benny that?
Wow. Get yourself a big deal. Wow. I feel like we got one. And this is Gary saying, keep your pants on, keep it fun. Thanks, everyone. We're out. Say goodbye, Candace. You could throw one in here, too. You got one? How about take the plunge? This is Candace saying, get the Karl, get the McDeal, and take the plunge.
Yeah. This is Candace. Get a big McDeal and take the plunge.
Yeah.
Goodbye, you morning flowers. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Wild Eye Podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with us, our email address is thewildeye@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We're the Wild Eye Podcast. And also on Twitch now for Wild Eye Harder. If you would like to help us keep this show going, look us up on Patreon, patreon.com/WildEye. The Wild Eye. The Wild Eye Podcast would like to thank the following patrons: Rob Tower, Conrad Erasmus Neubert, Corey Judd, Emma Wakeland, Kevin Stanley, Terry Chalmers, Ray Rastia, Dan Brown, Jan Jetmar, Manuel Sands, Mr. Stagg, Sylvia RPG Maps, Chris Grant, Robert Dorgan, Andy Hall, Brian Kaser, Daryl Texier, Jens Conheim, Sid the Squid, the Digital Dungeon Master, Knuckle Dave Anderson, Tori Bjertness Pearson, O-Shift, and Eric. Thank you. We'll see you later.